Okay, let's talk about the two different types of budgets that companies could have. They could have something called a static budget, which is actually set at one level of activity. And now it's going to ignore data for different levels of activity. So we would just compare the actual results against the budgeted results. Now, let me go into a little bit more detail about a static budget. So it's prepared at the beginning of a budgeting period and is valid only for the planned level of activity, so at only one activity level. It's suitable for planning, but it's inadequate for evaluating how well costs are controlled because the actual level of activity is unlikely to equal the planned level of activity. So comparing static budgets prepared with one level of activity and costs at another level of activity is like comparing apples and oranges. So what companies like to do is something called flexible budgets. There we can provide estimates of what costs should look like for any level of activity within the relevant range. So when used for performance evaluation, actual costs will be compared to the costs that should have been incurred at the actual level of activity, thereby enabling an apples-to-apples type cost comparison. Let me give you an example here. So we've got a static budget. This is at 10,000 machine hours, and then you can see the variable and fixed costs associated with the 10,000 machine hours. Now the issue then comes in, well, what happens if we only had 8,000 machine hours? That's why we have an apples to oranges type comparison. Obviously variable costs should be less if we're using fewer machine hours. So the question then becomes, how much of this difference between 89,000 and 77,350, which we're showing as a favorable $11,650 variance, was because they didn't achieve the 10,000 machine hours. So we have an unfavorable variance of 2,000 machine hours, and we're saying that's unfavorable because it's below what we budgeted for. But the question becomes, was that intentional, or did that happen, or did it happen somewhat accidentally? And then you can see here we're showing favorable variances for the variable costs, which again is to be expected because the actual level of activity was much less than the budgeted level of activity. So with this 11,650, how do we know how well Cheeseco has done at controlling costs? Have they done a good job or not? I mean, we projected 89,000 in costs and they came in at 77,350. Now the best way to go about and determine that is to insert a flexible budget at 8,000 machine hours. So we want to figure out exactly what expenses would have been projected at 8,000 machine hours so we can compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges. So right now we have an $11,650 favorable variance. Again, we don't know how much is due to good cost control versus just a lower level of activity. So what we will do is insert a flexible budget at 8,000 hours. So we can see that 15,000 of that variance was because they were at a lower level of activity. And we can see that $3,000 variance is actually unfavorable, which is due to poor cost control. They would have been budgeted for $74,000 at 8,000 hours, and they came in at $77,350. So the relevant question then is, how much of the favorable cost variance is due to lower activity and how much is due to good cost control? So we do need to flex the budget to the actual level of activity before we can make that decision. So here's an example where we can show how the flex budget at 8,000, 10,000, and 12,000 hours. So we would have multiple points where we could compare actual versus budgeted. Here's another one where we can look at the volume variance, which is the difference between the budget and the flexible budget. And recall that only the difference between these two budgets is the volume of units in which they are based. They both use the same budget assumption but a different volume. So the volume variance arises only because the volume of the cases actually sold differs from the volume originally anticipated in the master budget. So you can see here actual the actual numbers versus the master budget, which would have been at 25,000 cases sold, and they actually sold 28,724. Now the flexible budget variance is the difference between the flexible budget and the actual results. So we've got the actual and we've got the flex budget, which would be at the same level of activity. And then we have the volume variance, which will be the difference between the flexible budget and the master budget. So we can see which is the budget variance or good cost control and which is the volume variance, the changes due because we're operating at a different level of activity. Now, just to touch again, when we covered the first part of the chapters, we said that managers will use something called management by exception to determine which variances to investigate. So they're typically going to look for items that are high dollar amounts or high percentage changes. So upper level management relies on managers of each responsibility center to provide answers to their inquiries when they start asking those questions. Sometimes upper management already knows the reasons for the variances, yet they need the performance report to understand how their operational decisions are affecting the company's finances. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that upper management decided to modify its sales strategy beginning in March from the original plan found in the master budget. In order to increase sales, upper management decided to spend more on advertising, to increase the salaries of the sales staff, and to pay a higher sales commission per case, along with easing credit terms, so more sales qualified for credit rather than COD. The unfavorable flexible budget variances reflected these operating changes. However, the sales volume variance also showed positive effect of these changes. So now that we've prepared a flexible budget performance report, it's easy to see how the master budget variance can be viewed as a combination of two separate variances. Again, we will have the flexible budget variance, which will be due to cost controls, and the volume variance, which will be due to a different operating level of activity. So if managers want, they can actually break down the flexible budget variance into two additional variances, which are called the price variance and efficiency variance, to better understand what is causing the flexible budget variance. Manufacturers often do this for their direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead costs. And we will see more of this in a later chapter.